Doesn't matter what your personal views are, your politics, your religion, or where you are. And once you see the problem, you can't unsee it. It's like a one-way door. But thankfully, we also have the solution, and it's this solution that I'm so passionate about sharing, and it's what makes me just so optimistic for the future. The challenge I find, though, is how can anybody fully value a solution unless they understand what the problem is? And so I put this presentation together for some friends, and it assumes no knowledge other than just being a human being with some life experience. And they encouraged me then to make this presentation into video so I can share it with everyone. So I hope you enjoy. Welcome to What's the Problem? So what is the problem? Well, too many, unfortunately. I probably could have written twice as many things down on this slide. I think we all have that sense of unease. We all feel internally that things are not moving in the right direction in our lives, in the world. Like things are becoming harder, not easier. And I think for most of us, we recognize some elements of these things on the screen as touching our lives directly or indirectly. And what I'm here today to show you is that all these things may seem unconnected, but they're really not. The primary cause of all of these is the quality of our money. Now we're going to do this through a story. So imagine there's this far off world where you have hundreds of smart people traveling on a ship. And this ship gets wrecked on a deserted island. This deserted island is so far from everywhere else, they're effectively cut off. But the island is resource rich. It has everything they could possibly need to rebuild society. But because these people have come from an advanced civilization, they know exactly where they're ultimately going to get back to. But now they're starting again with nothing. What's also clear is that they need some way of trading with each other once they start to rebuild. So they prioritize deciding on what to use for their new money. And suspend your disbelief slightly further in that they have, despite not having anything, the ability to create whatever monetary system they want with whatever characteristics. So the first question they need to answer is, what makes good money? And there are 7 things. So these guys have the ability to create whatever they want. So instead of just creating good money, they create the perfect money. And the perfect money is scarce, which means it has a fixed supply forever, and is instantly and costlessly verifiable by everybody. So if everybody can check it whenever they want at no cost, then you can verify for yourself that nobody's creating any extra. It needs to be portable, so you can effortlessly move and store it with negligible costs. It needs to be divisible, and the perfect money would be infinitely divisible. It needs to be durable. It can't rot or go off. It can't deteriorate. So the perfect money exists forever. It's fungible, which means every piece is forever the same as every other piece. It needs to be acceptable. So everyone, anywhere, can both send and receive. And the really important one is it needs to be censorship resistant. You hold it yourself. Nobody can take it away from you without your permission, and no one can stop you sending or receiving it. So this is great. They decide on perfect money. But then there's a disagreement. 2 leaders emerge from within the population. The first, Satoshi, he says, well, given these are the characteristics of perfect money, that's going to be true today, true tomorrow, and true forever. So we should lock them in, you should never change. Whereas Fiatello, he says, well, I get that. I get this is the characteristics of perfect money, and I totally agree. But what if there's an emergency? What if we need to change something? What if the people we put in charge of our money feel like it's not working and need to make an adjustment? I think we should have the perfect money, but we should also have a big red button, which allows someone to press it and change any of the characteristics if we need to. Of course, no one ever will, but just in case. This becomes an irreconcilable disagreement. So a fairly drastic solution, but they build a huge wall right down the middle of this island. And on one side, they create the currency called Satoshis, which is perfect money always. And on the other side, are fiatellos, which is perfect money, but with the options changing. Now this wall is so big, it cuts off the communication and the trade between both sides on the island. So effectively, they're cut off from one another. So to begin with, nobody has anything on either side of the island. So everyone's starting from zero. And initially, people have to be self-sufficient. Each person is fishing for their food, cutting down trees for the wood to make fires, and also for houses, and then they're also building their own shelters. Now, even though they have perfect money, there's very limited trading here because people are working hard just to satisfy their day-to-day needs across all of these goods. But people are different. Some people are better at some things than others. And so people quickly realize that if I spend my time focusing on the things I'm good at, I'm reducing the amount of time I spend on things that I'm poor at, then I can contribute more to society. I can increase the amount of goods I can provide to society in the same amount of time as the average person. So the woodcutter spends all his time now cutting down wood. He stops fishing, he stops building shelters. And because he's spending his time cutting down wood, he increases the quantity of wood available to everyone else versus 3 people spending a third of their time each, because he's good at it. And not only does the increase in the quantity of wood available reduce the price of wood for everybody on the island, the quality is also high. He's better at doing it. He produces a higher quality output. So prices fall and quality increases. And not only that, he's not the only woodcutter. There are multiple woodcutters. So they're all competing to supply wood to everybody else, and they're competing at price and in terms of quality. And now what happens is, because the woodcutter needs other goods to survive, he has to sell the wood to buy fish, he has to sell the wood to pay for the services of the home builder. So now everybody is actively trading in this perfect money. Now, because processes continue to improve, the woodcutter can now satisfy the needs of the rest of the population for wood in a smaller amount of time. He can then take that time and think about his own processes, his own innovations. Maybe he can make cutting down wood even more efficient. And if he does that, it drives prices lower. It drives quality higher. Maybe he reaches the end of his innovation within his woodcutting, and maybe he lends it to the fisherman, who then builds a boat to increase the amount of fish the fisherman can catch for everybody. So what happens over time, in a free market with perfect money, prices go down forever and quality goes up forever. So what people see on both sides of the island is that the purchasing power of their money starts to increase. Goods cost less tomorrow than they do today, so the price of tomorrow is lower. The purchasing power of both currencies is increasing at about 3% a year. And this lifts the quality of life. Life becomes cheaper and cheaper over time for everybody, not just those people who are most productive in society. But the key thing is the money itself is becoming more valuable over time. That is, until these guys come along. So now, because the society is growing and the population is growing, both sides of the island elect a government. Now, it doesn't matter if the government is left or right, big, small, up, down, doesn't matter. They are all the same when it comes to this. Now, however well run the government is, inevitably it will hit a deficit at some point. And that means it's spending more than it's receiving. And that could be through mismanagement, but it could just be through external circumstance, like a natural disaster or something like this. The causes are not important, but it will happen over the course of time, inevitably. But now we see a divergence across both sides of the island. Satoshi, he only has 2 choices here. To balance the budget, he needs to either raise taxes or cut spending, or maybe a combination of the two. Whereas Fiatello, he has exactly the same choices, but he also has a big red button. And the important thing here is they're both up for re-election. And Fiatello knows that if he raises taxes or he cuts spending, it's going to cost him votes. So just this time, he decides to press the big red button and print a little bit of extra money for the government. Okay, so what are the consequences? Well, for Satoshi, not great. he cannot hide those changes from the population because they're paying more in taxes or they're getting less back from the government from its spending. So he loses the election, but government reduces in size naturally. So now overall, the efficiency in the economy is increased, but not only this, the social balance is improved within the economy because people now realize there is no free money. Taxes need to balance spending. But the important thing is prices continue to fall and quality continues to increase. Now for Fiatello, great news, he gets re-elected. And to start with, it's consequence free. Like he thinks this is the greatest thing ever. I get re-elected and there's no downside. But something's changed. So what's happened? Fiatello's pressed the big red button, which has printed some money for the government, which has debased the currency. So what does that mean? He's increased the amount of money in the economy overnight. But he hasn't increased the amount of goods and services available in the economy overnight. So now there's more Fiatellos washing around compared to yesterday for each piece of the goods and the services. And this has three major impacts. The first is a distortion of price signals. The second is that it increases input costs for businesses. And the third, it leads to asset inflation. And that first one, distorting price signals, well, prior to Fiatello pressing the big red button here, all price changes in the economy were purely a function of demand and supply because this was a free market with perfect money. But what's happened now is that money has entered the economy not to everybody equally or even in proportion to the amount of money everybody holds. The money has entered the economy via the government, and it enters via the government into the accounts of companies and people connected directly or indirectly to the government. So what Fiatello starts to see is price increases in certain parts of the economy. So the signal to everybody else in the economy is that there's an imbalance of supply and demand just in these sectors. So you see a misallocation of capital by the entrepreneurs in the market caused by the money printer. But not only that, it's human capital. It's smart people, it's active people who are trying to be productive, get sucked in closer to the government and not servicing the rest of the economy. The second is that business input costs increase. Now, every single business in Fiatello's country has at least a human being and some raw material inputs like energy or even some harder raw materials. Now, because the costs of these things have gone up, these businesses now need to try and change something about their product to maintain the small profit margins that ensure that they can continue in business. Now, the first and most obvious one is just to pass on the price increase to the customer. The second is to keep the price the same and the quality the same, but just shrink the product. So instead of having 100 grams, it's now 90 grams, but for the same price. Or the third one is to reduce the input costs. Now this is where consumer inflation comes from. This is the only source of consumer inflation, is the money printer, causing businesses to make these changes. But if a business passes on the price increase outright, or it shrinks the product and the customer now just needs to buy more of it to satisfy the fact that they needed 100 grams, not 90 grams, both of those things reduce affordability. So the population is becoming poorer. They're going to have less disposable income, despite buying the same as what they bought yesterday. If instead the business chooses to keep the price the same, the size the same, but just reduce the cost, the most obvious thing to do is just to fire people, which leads to unemployment. And now there are fewer people with jobs, which reduces the overall affordability for the population in Fiatello's world. But not only that, now the government's got a second issue it needs to solve. How does it help support all these people who are recently unemployed? But the most insidious way is for companies to reduce their input quality. And so what Fiatello starts to see is there's a rise in obesity across the population because the food that was previously fresh and had high quality ingredients is replaced with ever lower quality ingredients and more industrialized sludge. So this leads to obesity. It also leads to a myriad of secondary health issues, which causes a health crisis. And now the government has to step in and figure out how it needs to support all these people who are now unhealthy. The third is asset inflation. Since Vietello pressed the big red button, asset prices have been going up. The stock market goes higher and higher and higher. House prices go higher and higher and higher. He thinks I'm some sort of economic genius. But they're going up in price because he's just created more Vietellos. So anybody who knows that there are more Vietellos in the system, of course, wouldn't sell their asset for the same as they did yesterday. They would take into account the fact that there were just more Vietellos in the system. So this is what is driving these prices up. But this asset increase is good for the people who own the assets, but not for the people who don't. So you have a wealth inequality begin to emerge across the economy. And not just that, because house prices are now more expensive, the rent is more expensive. So you see increased levels of homelessness. And this increased levels of homelessness, guess what, require more government intervention to try and deal with. And now asset prices are flying, the stock market's on fire. The prevailing perception across the population is, why would I not invest? Why would I just keep the money? I should be buying the stock market, I should be investing, I should be buying a second home to rent out, I should be buying speculative assets because they never go down, they just go up. If I don't invest, I'm a fool. And because the assets are going up, the banks are pushing ever more leverage for people, pushing bigger and bigger mortgages to individuals, to loans to companies. But now that house prices have gone up, and now that everyone has more debt, at the same time as families are struggling with affordability of day-to-day life, it's now much harder to buy a house. So families where previously they could have one main earner and afford to buy a house with a mortgage can't anymore. You now need both parents working. Both parents working to afford the mortgage and afford to live. And when that happens, people spend less time together and you start to see the breakdown of the nuclear family. They spend less time with their children. They can afford to have fewer children. Now, because you have decline in birth rates, Vietello starts to see a change in his demographics across the population. Fewer children are being born, whereas the older generations are living longer. And he now starts to realize that the promises he made to these older generations about being able to retire at a certain age or having a good quality of life or defined income in their retirement can't be delivered upon. For those not lucky enough to be able to buy a house, who are maybe stuck renting. Whereas before, they could think about renting the same place for 3 years or 5 years because the rent goes up too much every year. So now they're thinking about 1 year, maybe 2 years. You're planning less for the future. Maybe you're putting off getting married, putting off having children. You start to prioritize today at the expense of tomorrow. People see that they're saving their Vietellos never gets them anywhere because the asset prices are going up too quickly. They'll never be able to buy a house. So if you never be able to buy a house, then prioritize living your best life and going on a holiday and spending more, enjoying yourself. But for those not fortunate to be in this position, for those that every day is a struggle feeding themselves and their families, housing themselves and their families, they're stuck on a treadmill of decline. Now, every day is harder, which leads to a growth in addiction, various forms of addiction, including opioids across Vietello's island, which leads to yet more of a health crisis and yet more intervention from the government. And all of this leads to a mental health crisis across the population. And now the government finds itself in a position where, because it's pressed the big red button, it's created a whole range of secondary issues that now it needs to step in and try and solve. And because it has to step in and try and solve these things, it means the government needs to divert more capital to these areas of the economy, which again is a greater misallocation of capital, which pulls more entrepreneurs into the wrong parts of the economy through the distortion of the price signals. And between the increased leverage in the economy driven by the banks and the misallocation of capital, it sows the seeds of the next emergency. And Vietello has only one choice, and that's to press the big red button again. And now he's starting to realize that actually this wasn't consequence-free. But now he's lurching from crisis to ever bigger crisis. He presses the big red button, which debases the currency, which leads to bigger government and more involvement in everything. And now not only is the government bigger, but the government has spawned a series of parasitic industries attached to it. Big pharma, who are increasingly involved with the government to try to deal with the symptoms, but not the causes of the various health crises. Never incentivized to actually cure a patient, just to treat them long term, because A healthy customer is a lost customer. Big food pushes for ever lower food standards across the economy. The military-industrial complex pushes for ever greater spending on defence both at home and on foreign shores. Wall Street are up to their eyeballs in debt and now so leveraged that the government wants to protect them. They can't be allowed to fail, because if the banks fail, the population loses their money, the government falls. The government also continues to make unproductive investments trying to deal with the secondary issues it's created, but also investments driven from whatever political ideology the government has. And all of these things are effectively now crony corporatism. It's very hard to see where the government ends and these industries begin. The success of the government is deeply intertwined with the success of the industries. These industries start to ask the government to become regulators. You need to regulate us to protect the public. But this regulation, all it does is make competition harder. The 1, 2, 3 companies in each of these areas are now very, very close to the government. They supply the people for the regulator. When the regulators end their tenure, they go back and work for these companies. It stops smaller companies coming in and competing with them to then supply the government on better terms with higher quality product. So quality starts to decline and prices start to rise, which of course is great news for these companies because profit margins go up. What happens then is the media gets captured. The government is teetering to maintain social stability. It's now protecting these industries at the expense of the population rather than the other way around. And because of this social balance that it needs to maintain, it can't allow free speech, dissent, alternative opinions, or questioning of anything that undermines the legitimacy of the government in any way. Not only that, the biggest advertisers for the media companies are the companies connected to the government. So the media companies increasingly don't want to upset their advertisers. And when you have a captured media and a military-industrial complex fomenting strife on foreign shores, you get the creation of the forever wars. And the wars themselves are actively supported by the Fiatello population because all they see in their media is that we have to do this because it's the right thing to do. And between the forever wars and the banking system bailouts and the excessive debt, it leads to the next emergency, but this time it's just so much bigger. And the only choice he has is to press the big red button again. But this time it's different. It's a massive erosion of trust. Every time he presses the button, more and more people become aware of what is happening. And this goes round and round and round until something breaks. And now Fiatello's starting to get quite worried. So what's happening to the money? Well, instead of increasing 3% a year in purchasing power, he's now losing 7% a year because he's printing 10% a year of extra money. And not only that, he's undermining the productivity in the economy by distorting all the price signals. So what happens to the Fiatello Island population? Well, the poor, who are on fixed wages, have very low income security and no assets. They can't win. They just get poorer every single year. For the middle earners, who have fixed salaries and mixed income security, they're not the first to be fired. They often have a home. They can never sell the home and realize any gain because you've got to live somewhere. If you sell one home, you've got to buy another home. You might have some investments, but they are becoming the new poor. Well, surely the wealthy are doing well. Their income is largely from asset yields, from operating businesses or investing. Their income security is high because they can't get fired. But for them, it's death by 1,000 cuts. They see their wealth as a number continue to increase. But they feel like they're getting poorer. Life continues to get harder. And that's because the rate at which they're earning money, their yield on their assets, is below the rate at which Fiatello is printing money. So they're slowly having their wealth siphoned away by the politically connected. Those that are government funded and have fully insulated income security. And perversely, their income goes up and becomes even more valuable as society continues to decline because the government needs more and more intervention. And it's really just industrialized theft at this point from everyone else in society. But now so much time has passed that the wall down the middle of the island starts to crack. And it starts to crack in such a way that both people and money can start to flow from one side to the other. So on the one side, you've got the Satoshis increasing their purchasing power at 3% a year. On the other side, you've got the Fiatellos that are losing 7% purchasing power every year. So what happens? Why? What Fiatello starts to see is that money and people start to leave because they don't trust their ability to save using Fiatellos. They want Satoshis. Okay, so this sums it up. On a Fiatello standard, your money is stealing from you. Whereas on a Satoshi standard, the whole world is working 24/7 to increase your purchasing power. But now the escape valve is open. People realize they can't save in Fiatellos, so they start selling Fiatellos to buy Satoshis. So the Fiatellos decline further in value, triggering yet more budgetary and currency crises for Fiatello to deal with. And the only choice is to press the big red button again. But this time, printing money is not enough because value is leaking out of Fiatello's side of the island. He needs to change another characteristic of perfect money, which is to remove the censorship-resistant nature of it. So the Fiatello population used to be able to hold the money themselves. Now Fiatello says, no longer allowed to hold it yourselves, you have to put it in the banks. The banks are going to hold everybody's money. The population now feel that they are guilty until proven innocent for making any transaction. The banks will check every transaction to protect you. Which means when people are trying to buy certain things, including Satoshis, the banks now say no. It's because of this, it's because of that, it's because of the other. He restricts the flow of capital out of Fiatello's side of the island. He may even just create explicit capital controls. You're now no longer allowed to buy Satoshis at all. But people always find a way, and more people are waking up to what's happening, and the cycle continues. But the important thing is the wealth and the people flee to the uncorrupted money. And now Fiatello is beginning to really panic. So where does it end for Fiatello? Well, if he's lucky, with sustained inflation, allowing the government to inflate away its debts and slowly siphon away the wealth of the public. This may even border on hyperinflation. I say lucky because it's very hard to do that and maintain social cohesion, and something is likely to go wrong. It will definitely be asset seizures. Now that all the money is held in the banks, one day Fiatello will decree that we're all in it together, and the banks will hand over a proportion of that capital to the government. Just like in Cyprus in 2013, if you held over 100,000 euros in the bank overnight, 45% of that went to the government. The public was effectively bailed in to bail out the banks and the government from their own mismanagement. It also happened in the US in 1933. They made gold holdings for the individual illegal. And this lasted for almost 40 years. If you held more than $100 of gold and you were caught, $10,000 fine or 10 years in prison. And this is when $10,000 was a huge amount of money. Fiatello sees a rise in political extremism on both ends of the spectrum. The government never explains to the population where these problems are coming from. They don't tell them it's because of the money printing via the big red button. They control the media. The government is protective of itself. They don't tell the population the truth. They don't help the population join the dots. They don't explain the link from the big red button to the issues. They blame it on the greedy businessmen, or the billionaires, or that foreign dictator, or this or that. And then what happens is people ask for more help and more support from the government to deal with all of these issues. And so the only solution is the government's involved in everything. So at every step of this journey, the solution to all the problems has always been more government involvement. And so the people see these problems and vote for more government involvement to solve them. Or something worse. But in all scenarios, people want to hold Satoshis and not Fiatellos. So if we go back to that list of 7 characteristics of perfect money, Fiatello only changed
So, yeah, this was the problem that the guy is trying to explain, and how money printing is the cause of every problem, that like 99%, 99.99% of the problems which we are facing today, most probably the cause is money printing and monetary debasement. So yeah, this was I mean, the video, and if somebody wants to add, then feel free to. Otherwise, I can like go to the next thing.
Yeah, so one of the thoughts that I had while this video was running, and
Hmm.
they mentioned like on foreign dictators, all that. Like it just so it reminded me of this whole Putin conversation. But more than that, like, what is it? It's impossible for a country to have satoshis as their unit of currency right now. Like they have central banks. At the worst, they will peg their currency on Bitcoin. But the only realistic way in which I see that happening is if any country takes, like Czech Republic, other countries take a bold decision of like abandoning capital gains altogether. That is the only way that probably all those people who have any kind of assets in any world will buy Bitcoin in Czech, set up a company, and pay 0% capital gains for as long as possible, or in US if it happens. So I see that as the chink in the armor. But other than that, I do not see any other way in which uh, a country will have satoshis and other countries will have fiat elo. Like all the countries will have some form of fiat elo.
Yeah, I think the erosion in trust is not there yet, right? Because I mean, with Donald Trump doing crypto strategic reserve, it just goes on to show that we are not at the stage where there is a massive erosion of trust in institutions. Because most people are not, like, this video puts it brilliantly, right, about the whole problem, but it's not at the stage where most people are feeling that palpably in their lives. So yeah, maybe this is like, yeah, going to be more and more relevant 5 years, 10 years from now. Yeah, I don't know. The
What
timeline is difficult to predict though.
hmm, I think is that people are facing problems, but they don't know the reason.
Yeah, and I think it uh, points out the reason, right, that the media is captured. So the government
Media is captured. That's the
protects
main thing.
itself. Yeah.
Hmm. So, anybody wants to add anything, or should we continue to why strategy might become one of the most important company in the world?
Yeah, just curious.
So,
Uh, do we have to watch the rest of the video on our own? But I mean, have you watched it?
actually, the rest of the video was this. If you can see my screen,
Right.
basically it's a chart where he compares. Like we all know these properties of money. So
Right.
I thought that this is known to like Bitcoiners. So
Makes sense.
I
Makes sense.
I stopped it. Even the like the screen where US is in the deficit, like their income is much lesser than what they spend. So yeah, this depicts that problem, and what are the consequences? Consequences lead to like M2 increasing.
Yeah,
So I think like as Bitcoiners we know this. So I
makes
thought
sense.
uh, it will be this is pretty interesting. Like India here, I think around, yeah, 24%. So whatever we saw in the video was relating to US, and 7% depreciation or debasement was considering the US dollar. But when you live in India, and things are much worse for you. So yeah, that was the thing. And At last he comes to the conclusion around like the history of government management of money has, except for a few short happy periods, been one of incessant fraud and deception. So this was given by Friedrich Hayek, one of the great Austrian economists. So what's the solution? He says that Bitcoin, a separation of money and state, and fix the money, fix the world. So yeah, good news. Satoshis are real. Bitcoin is real. Basically, Bitcoin is the solution, and yeah, that's what like he tries to explain further. But yeah, so this was basically the remaining part. So if anybody has a doubt or anything to add, like they are free to, but uh, if not, I can continue. Like why strategy might become one of the most important company. Okay, so yeah, I think Saurabh, are you sharing your screen or like why I'm seeing your screen?
I mean, I'm not sharing my screen, am I?
Yes, now not. Okay,
Oh, might be a mistake. Yeah.
yeah. I'm muting myself, so yeah, there's another short part of a video which Joe Bryan has given. Like it was an internal presentation to uh, the strategies company. So yeah, we look forward to a small part where to why strategy might become one of the most important company in the near or in the future.
And they get paid in fiat telos. And they see the next day, 1923, where it shows the number of paper marks after the end of the First World War that were required to buy one gold mark, which is someone has access to a big red bunch of particular interests to factors to support. It's just about keeping the show on the road. But the inevitability is just more and more money gets printed. So there's more and more debasement, and each of these factors just gets more and more accentuated. But the one area of
So yeah, before starting, like there was a guy in Germany who is like what I would say, multi-billionaire or trillionaire in that time. If we consider inflation and account for inflation, like in the starting of the video, the he explained like Hugo Steins. He was a German businessman. A person who is close to the printer and how he became one of the most like, one of the most richest and of the world. Like at the peak he was around like around 10 times much more richer than Elon Musk. Like I was amazed about like when he said that. But yeah, so I am muting myself.
this chart, which is of particular interest to strategy, is asset inflation. And it's what we're going to talk about next. So what did Hugo Stein do? Well, what happens in fiat economies where someone has access to a big red button is inevitably they press it and they press it and they press it and they press it some more. And we've all seen pictures like this from our history books. And this was Germany in the early 20s, 100 years ago. But the same has happened all around the world, all around the world. Because inevitably, fiat currencies just print fiat telos. There is no other end game here. And this is exactly what happened in Germany. And this chart on the left is obviously a 6-year period from 1918 through start of 1918 through to the end of 1923, where it shows the number of paper marks after the end of the First World War that were required to buy one gold mark, and it went from around 1 to 1 trillion in 6 years. And so what happened? Well, they had access to a big red button, and so they printed fiat telos, and obviously they printed marks, but I'm going to talk about fiat telos because all fiat currencies are just fiat telos. And the people realized increasingly that they couldn't save their economic energy. They go out and do a day's work and they get paid in fiat telos, and they see the next day those fiat telos are worth less. They then want to get rid of the fiat telos as quickly as possible into something which is a better store of their economic energy. Now, Hugo Steins recognized this very early on, and so not only did he get rid of his fiat telos, he took the opposite side of that. He went out and borrowed as many fiat telos as he possibly could to buy hard assets. And for him, hard assets was companies, it was infrastructure, it was commodities. He ended up owning around 4,500 big companies in Germany over this 2 or 3 year period. And so what happened? He borrowed these fiat telos, and then the fiat telos declined further in value, effectively eroding his debts in real terms. And because the fiat telos were declining, there was yet more and more budgetary and currency crises, and the government had no choice but to just hit the big red button again. And this went round and round and round, and he just repeated the same cycle over and over again. And it was almost perfect, almost. And so what really was he doing? Well, the government have the big red button, and the question is, are they going to press it? And if they press it or they don't press it, which side are you on? Are you on the losing side? Are you on the winning side? And when you watch the video, you'll understand that most of society here is on the losing side. Even the wealthy are on the losing side here. The politically connected are the only segment of society that benefit from the money printing. But all of society is more on the side of they will never press it, because they're either unaware that the government is pressing the button, or they don't have access to certain things which would enable them to bet on the fact that they will press it forever. And what Hugo was able to do was leverage his position and his access to financial markets to take the other side of the bet. So he leveraged up as much as he could in the thing that was going to zero to buy the thing that was of limited quantity. And so buying these companies, buying commodities, enabled him to use them as effective economic storage, economic energy storage, while everything else got inflated away. Now, that was an amazing bet, but it could have been better. He was missing something. He was missing Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the ultimate here, but it didn't exist. But now here we are, 100 years later.
We don't have audio on the
First,
video, so explain what they're saying.
You can't hear it. Oh, that's a shame. I'm just gonna skip on. That is effectively Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve. Apologies, I thought you'd be able to hear the video. Explaining to 60 Minutes that the US government, the central bank, can print as much money as it wants, but it doesn't tend to print it physically, although it can, and it distributes it via the Federal Reserve. They just print it digitally, and they can print as much of it as they like. And he's only saying what we all already know. But the complexity with which the money printing occurs via quantitative easing or all of the technical jargon goes to hide the fact that the monetary base is just expanding in exactly the same way as it expanded for Germany in the early 1920s and every other country around the world. And so it's just nice to hear it in his own words, in his own voice. But this chart here is, again, taken from the video, but this shows the red chart on the left-hand axis is the monetary base in the US, which is now north of 22 trillion, and the billions has tripled. In 1971, you could exchange. Effectively, it allowed the US to print as much. Now, there's a range there because they're paid in exactly the same. This is an everywhere problem. The US is just going. The US dollar is just going to zero more slowly than everything else. And so, how does this affect you guys? Well, strategy is just doing the Hugo Stein's trade. Strategy is the next inflation king. The US government is pressing the big red button, or the central bank. People realize they can't save their economic energy in fiatellos. And we all know this. Like, everybody knows this intuitively, that you can't put money in the bank and expect the purchasing power to be the same in a year's time, or 5 years' time, or 10 years' time. You can't. You can't. It's being stolen. It's being stolen through inflation. And the inflation is higher than the central bank tell us, because we all know it. We'll see it with our own eyes when we go to the shops. We go to the grocery store. We know the inflation is not 2% or 5%. It's like 10% more. We know this. But then strategy borrows fiatellos to not just buy hard assets, but to buy Bitcoin. And the fiatellos decline further in value, triggering more budgetary and currency crises, and you have to press the big red button again, and the cycle just goes round and round and round. And this is what strategy is doing. But it's also not. Like, strategy is not the next inflation king. It's the last inflation king. There is nothing that comes after this, because Bitcoin is the final destination here. Bitcoin is the only absolutely scarce asset in the entire universe. There is nothing harder than Bitcoin. There is nothing to move to from Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is the separation of money and state. So it can't be inflated away. So you guys are the last. But you also have a second advantage. A second advantage that Hugo Steins didn't have. You're actually not the last inflation king. You're the last inflation and monetization king. Of where Bitcoin sits in the list of assets in the world. And it's 7th, so it's just above silver. If you look at what's above it, you've got gold, and then you've got 5 companies. To think that the total value of Bitcoin is less than any company in the world, let alone 5 of them, is ludicrous. Bitcoin is decentralized, immutable, neutral money for the world. It's a civilizational change technology. We're going to go through this once, like the internet. And Bitcoin's going to make the internet, the change to our lives from the internet, pale in significance. Because the internet only affects our online lives and our offline lives by a lack of attention, I guess. But money affects everything. It affects our day-to-day decision making. It affects our goals. It affects our life choices. It affects everything. And to think that Bitcoin is worth less than any company, let alone 5 of them, is ludicrous. And even if your mental model for Bitcoin was, well, it's just digital gold, even if it was as limited as that, which is not a bad place to start, absolutely. Well, Bitcoin is so much more than that. But even if it was just that, it's 1/10 of gold. It beats gold hands down on every single measure that you could care to evaluate it. And so we are just so early. And really what Bitcoin is competing against is not assets, it's asset classes. And the numbers on this table for Bitcoin and gold slightly don't match the previous table because this is taken from a slightly different time. Thank you to Jesse Myers. But the visual representation here shows how early we are. Bitcoin is 2 trillion and the total global asset base is 900 trillion plus. Bitcoin is going to eat gold. It's going to eat art. It's going to eat cars and collectibles. It's going to eat all of these things. It's going to eat real estate. It's going to eat them because all of these things have been monetized. We know we can't keep our dollars in the bank because they're declining to zero. So what do? We buy a second house. We buy the stock market. We buy some collectibles because they're a better store of value. But we wouldn't have done that if we could have bought Bitcoin. Because Bitcoin smashes everything else. So Bitcoin's going to eat all of these things. It's going to demonetize them all. And so the end game here is that they just continue to press the big red button. And the more they do, the more Bitcoin eats the world. And the more Bitcoin eats the world, the more they need to press the big red button. And it's just inevitable. The outcome is inevitable. We're just so early. And it's inevitable through game theory because every individual, every company, every country in the world is going to end up owning Bitcoin. It is money for you, it's money for your friends, it's money for your competitors, but it's money for your enemies as well. And if you know everyone's going to buy it, and you know if you don't buy it, you're at a disadvantage, then you have to buy it. And if you have to buy it, you buy it as early as possible, and you buy as much of it as possible. And this is exactly what you guys are doing. And you have one amazing final advantage, is that you're in America. And you are at the home of the free market. You may not feel like that all the time, but compared to everywhere else, you're in the freest market in the world. And you have access to an inordinate amount of capital and a huge amount of innovative capital. And so that combined with the fact that you've got this inflation trade and the monetization trade, and you're in the best country in the world to execute this, it just means strategy is the most important company in the world today. And beyond that, it's going to become the most valuable company in the world today. And I hope, and the reason for that is Bitcoin. It's Bitcoin. And, I realize, the vast majority of people who work for MicroStrategy probably wouldn't class themselves as Bitcoiners today. But I would hope, perhaps when you've seen the video or after this presentation, you might be more motivated to
So yeah, this is how uh, strategy will eventually become the most valuable company in the world. And when he showed that assets chart wherein gold was first, and after the magnificent five, or like five companies were there, and then uh, Bitcoin was there. So today a company is much more valuable than Bitcoin, which 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 tells you like Bitcoin is heavily undervalued. Like in one of our sessions, I have uh, uh, I have introduced you about Roxom site uh, where the market cap of the company was described in number of bitcoins. So the Apple's market cap, the Microsoft's market cap was around 34 million Bitcoin. So that will be never that much Bitcoin will never exist. And yeah, at that point, if I remember it right, JK made a point where he said that this just shows like how undervalued is Bitcoin currently. So yeah, that was about it. Uh, Jatin, you can stop recording, and the lounge is open for everybody to